the newsagents.
We almost got to the end of the year without Piers Morgan becoming the story. Almost.
I've never hacked a phone or told anybody else to hack a phone, and nobody has produced any actual evidence to prove that I did.
That was the man himself giving a statement outside his own front door, forced to address allegations of phone hacking during his editorship of the Daily Mirror some 2 decades ago. That's because, and this will perhaps sting Morgan most, Prince Harry has won. He's won in his court battle against the owners of the Daily Mirror in a judgment which will ricochet through the British press. The judge has ruled that there was extensive phone hacking by Mirror Group newspapers from 2006 to 2011. He said that 2 of the most senior directors of the company knew about it, and that there can be, quote, no doubt that the former editor, Piers Morgan, and other senior editors and lawyers at the newspaper group knew about phone hacking and other illegal information gathering, something they've always denied. So on today's show, what this ruling means for Prince Harry, Piers Morgan, the long-running phone hacking affair, and the British press. It's Lewis here. Welcome to the Newsagents.
Today is a great day for truth, as well as accountability. The court has ruled that unlawful and criminal activities were carried out at all 3 Mirror Group newspaper titles, the Mirror, the Sunday Mirror and the People, on a habitual and widespread basis for over more than a decade. I'd like to thank my legal team for so successfully dismantling the sworn testimony of Mirror Group's senior executives, legal department and journalists who at least turned up to court, unlike their colleagues who were perhaps too afraid to do so. This case is not just about hacking. It is about a systemic practice of unlawful and appalling behaviour, followed by cover-ups and destruction of evidence, the shocking scale of which can only be revealed through these proceedings. The court has found that Mirror Group's principal board directors, their legal department, senior executives and editors such as Piers Morgan clearly knew about or were involved in these illegal activities. Between them, they even went as far as lying under oath to Parliament during the Leveson inquiry, to the Stock Exchange, and to us all ever since.
That was the Duke of Sussex's lawyer, David Sherborne, standing outside the High Court, flush with victory, having won 15 claims in his client's case against the Mirror Group newspapers of unlawfully gathering information for stories published about him, with the court revealing evidence of, quote, widespread and habitual use of phone hacking at the Mirror newspapers. Harry was awarded £140,000 in damages, but this was never about the money. In his own words, it's been about accountability, a war against the press which to some extent began in his own tragic childhood. He took the case on, knowing his own family was desperate for him not to do so. In a statement, he said, "I've been told that slaying dragons will get you burned, but in light of today's victory and the importance of doing what is needed for a free and honest press, it's a worthwhile price to pay." It could lead to many more litigants coming forward, and the Mirror Group has already had to pay £100 million in damages and legal costs on previous hacking cases. Previously, it had mainly been the journalists of Rupert Murdoch and News International in the frame for hacking. Remember this?
I would just like to say one sentence. This is the most humble day of my life.
Rupert Murdoch dragged in front of Parliament a decade ago to account for his newspaper's actions, including the hacking of murdered schoolgirl Millie Dowler's phone. The scandal, exposed by dogged reporting from the Guardian newspaper, engulfed politics, the press, led to the closure of the Behemoth, which was the news of the world, the imprisonment of David Cameron's spin doctor and former newspaper editor Andy Coulson, and a public inquiry, the Leveson inquiry, which damaged the reputation of nearly everyone caught up in it. Astoundingly, part of the judgment today revealed that hacking continued even during the Leveson inquiry itself. This story is still unwinding a decade on, largely as a result of the personal mission of Prince Harry and other affected celebrities. And despite the fact that this case involves huge themes of politics, of press and princes, it is as much as anything an extraordinary battle of wills, of profound enmity between 2 men, Harry and and Piers Morgan. It's worth listening to the full statement a rather flushed-looking Morgan gave outside his home, teeth almost flashing.
I've never hacked a phone or told anybody else to hack a phone, and nobody has produced any actual evidence to prove that I did. I wasn't called as a witness, and it's important for people to know this, by either side in the case, nor was I asked to provide any statement. I would have very happily agreed to do either or both of those things had I been asked. Nor did I have a single conversation with any of the Mirror Group lawyers throughout the entire legal process. So, I wasn't able to respond to the many false allegations that were spewed about me in court by old foes of mine with an axe to grind, most of which, inexplicably, were not even challenged in my absence by the Mirror Group counsel. But I note the judge appears to have believed the evidence of Omid Scobie, who lied about me in his new book, and he lied about me in court, and the whole world now knows him to be a deluded fantasist. And he believed the evidence of Alistair Campbell, another proven liar who spun this country into an illegal war. Finally, I want to say this. Prince Harry's outrage at media intrusion into the private lives of the royal family is only matched by his own ruthless, greedy and hypocritical enthusiasm for doing it himself. He talked today about the appalling behaviour of the press. But this is a guy who's repeatedly trashed his family in public for hundreds of millions of dollars, even as two of its most senior and respected members were dying, his grandparents. It's hard to imagine, frankly, more appalling behaviour than that. As for him saying this is a good day for truth, the Duke has been repeatedly exposed in recent years as someone who wouldn't know the truth if it slapped him around his California tanned face. He demands accountability for the press, but refuses to accept any for himself for smearing the royal family, his own family, as a bunch of callous racists without producing a shred of proof to support those disgraceful claims. He also says he's on a mission to reform the media when it's become clear his real mission, along with his wife, is to destroy the British monarchy. And I will continue to do whatever I can to stop them.
A reminder that the judge, Mr. Justice Harcourt, accepted the evidence of witnesses who said that Morgan knew about hacking, even boasted about it. He said in his ruling there is compelling evidence that the editors of each newspaper knew very well that voicemail interception was being used extensively and habitually, and that they were happy to take the benefits of it. Evan Harris is a former Lib Dem MP and leader of the Hacked Off campaign group.
Well, the content of the judgment is astonishing because the judge found a number of things. Firstly, he found that phone hacking and other unlawful information gathering didn't stop in 2006 with the original trial of Goodman and Mulcair. It carried on into 2011, even during the Leveson inquiry, which was set up to inquire into the scandal of phone hacking. A judge has found, looking at the evidence, that it continued even during the inquiry. Not only that, he found in very clear terms that editors, including, and he named him, Piers Morgan, used phone hacking, knew about it, and concealed it. For example, he cited the example of the famous Ulrika Jonsson, Sven-Göran Eriksson affair story that he splashed on the 3am pages, his celebrity pages, in the early 2000s, which he always claimed he obtained legitimately and said so under oath. The judge said that clearly came from phone hacking, Ulrika Jonsson's agent, Melanie Cantor. It's written in the judgment. And that means that what Piers Morgan has said ever since, both in public, on his huge media platform and through his newspaper columns, and under oath at the Leveson inquiry, that he didn't know how to hack a phone, he never hacked a phone, he never asked anyone to do it, and he never knowingly published a story from it, is not true. And it's a very serious matter, as with all these things. The cover-up is worse than the crime, even worse than the crime, for him to have given untrue evidence under oath at the Leveson inquiry. And that's made clear in this judgment. If rule of law is to mean anything in this country, the police and prosecution authorities must now investigate.
And guess what? This isn't even over. Harry isn't done. He's still bringing 2 more separate phone hacking cases against the publisher of The Sun, which will begin in January, and the publisher of the Daily Mail. Right, well, we're joined now by one of the lawyers of the victims of phone hacking, Jonathan Code. Jonathan, could you just, for people who are probably dimly aware that this has been going on for a long time, but obviously haven't followed the very complicated kind of twists and turns of this very long-running story, can you place today's case into sort of context in the wider story and just give us a sense of how important and significant it is?
Well, it's seismic for all sorts of reasons. One, because the king's second son has been the claimant. Secondly, because he has pretty well single-handedly taken on one of the most powerful organisations in the country. Reach, Mirror Group newspapers as it was, wields huge power. It has vast resources, which it's thrown in this case in terms of armies of lawyers trying to cover up the wrongdoing. He's fought this battle and he has won, and he's won in a very big way, because here is a finding by a judge that there was systemic criminality at Mirror Group newspapers, and that went right down from two board members, Paul Vickers and Sly Bailey, through the legal department and down below that. And on that basis, it is the most extraordinary thing that a member of the royal family has held such a vast organisation to account in such a spectacular way.
And this has come about because Harry long suspected that it wasn't just News International that had been hacking his phone, and this has been a sort of personal campaign for him that he's conducted for some time.
It is, and of course he's been proved absolutely right. I mean, I doubt whether the people who read The Sun or read the Mail, or indeed read the Mirror, will be told in any way what the findings of the judge have been, but he has set out on a mission to bring to attention of the country just how badly behaved Fleet Street in its tabloid incarnation has been. And what now we need to find out is the extent to which the authorities, in terms of the police, the government, the financial authorities, what they're going to do about it. Because there's been a finding of serial criminality against a number of people. And are the police going to investigate?
In narrow terms for the Mirror Group, what does this Reach? What does this mean? I mean, will they have to pay compensation? Will they now be subject to further lawsuits, etc.?
Well, they are in the way of a whole heap of lawsuits. There are dozens of them. They are spending astronomical sums of money on lawyers to try and cover up the extent to which they're guilty of all these things. I mean, we know for certain that they've destroyed lots of evidence. And despite all the efforts of the brave legal teams that are fighting on behalf of these victims, will never know the truth. But so far as the Mirror is concerned, well, it's been seriously found guilty. And what should happen is that there is a public outcry at the fact the Mirror still regulates itself effectively through the Independent Press Standards Organisation, and there should be a public call for that to change.
One of the most striking things, Jonathan, when I was reading the judgment, is that we just learn that phone hacking was still going on during the Leveson inquiry. The Leveson inquiry being set up to investigate standards in the press arising from the phone hacking scandal. And as that was happening, there was still phone hacking.
It is mind-boggling that that is the case. But what that tells us is there is an utter sense of invulnerability on the part of the press. They just think that such is their power that they are never going to be held to account. And the reason for that is they've been able to effectively block politicians from holding to them account, because they'll quiet conversations. If you bring this kind of regulation in or that kind of regulation is, guess what? You're not going to win the next election.
But Jonathan, doesn't it mean, I mean, the fact that the judge has said this, I mean, that means that we know that there was criminal behaviour that was going on. Surely that means that someone must be held to account for it at some point. There will be individuals who are held accountable for it.
Well, of course they should. But we live in a democratic society, and we live in a society, as Leveson indeed found, where the press exerts huge power, and that power extends to the police. Imagine what kind of power has been exercised by News UK, Rupert Murdoch or whatever, to ensure that even the extent to which her office is being searched is controlled by her or her lawyers.
So your fear is that despite the fact that the judge has found, comprehensively so, that there was criminal behaviour at Reach, at the Mirror, your fear remains that the police won't act on it in terms of individual acts of wrongdoing and criminality.
That is my fear. What needs to happen is what happened to Andy Coulson. People need to be put into jail. And at the top of my list is Piers Morgan. You know, Teflon Piers, who has so far somehow managed to escape being held responsible for his actions, and nobody thinks that there's a coincidence, the fact that News of the World was leading the phone hacking race, and then shortly after Piers joined the Mirror, it started there. People like Piers Morgan need to be held to account, and the reason for that is because if senior executives know that there's a chance of going to jail, then people like Paul Vickers and Sly Bailey will think twice about condoning that activity in their newspapers. That's why it's so important that people are put behind bars for this criminal activity.
Because Piers Morgan has always, for context, Piers Morgan has always denied that he ever hacked a phone and that he was responsible for it, or that if it happened while he was editor of the Daily Mirror, he wasn't aware of it. And you're saying, and the judge is saying, and the judge has found that to be incredible in the literal sense.
He's flatly rejected that suggestion without any equivocation. Piers Morgan pops up about 300 times in the judgment. I mean, he absolutely unequivocally finds that Piers Morgan was up into his neck in this. But think about it realistically. First thing that any journalist or any editor will ask if a story pops up, where did you get the story from? I mean, obviously. So the suggestion, Piers Morgan, I probably didn't personally hack a phone, but that's not the point. He got minions to do that. It was the job of the private investigators and the dark individuals who went around doing it. Piers Morgan, nonetheless, must have known it was going on and must have authorised the payments for it to go on.
Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate your time.
You're welcome.
Well, we're joined now by Roy Greenslade. He was editor of the Daily Mirror in the early 1990s. Roy, what is your reaction to the news today? It's a very, very big day for Reach and for the Daily Mirror.
I think it's a turn of events I never expected to happen. I'd rather given up on the idea that anyone would be brought to account for the hacking saga. It must be something like 12 years ago when I first alleged that hacking must have gone on at the Mirror. This was denied vociferously by Sly Bailey, the chief executive, by Paul Vickers, the group legal director, and they swore that it hadn't happened. I pushed and pushed, and eventually they decided to hold an investigation. It's the most laughable investigation anyone has ever held. It involved Paul Vickers writing to the editors and senior journalists and asking them if hacking had taken place, as if any of them at that stage would have admitted it. That was the level of the investigation. They simply pulled down the cover and covered up thereafter. So this is an extraordinary day. I'm sure Harry feels vindicated, but I think it's wider than Prince Harry. I mean, all of those people who suffered from hacking due to the Mirror in that period will feel vindicated, will feel that what they said happened finally has been given credence by a judge. And I didn't expect the judge. The other surprise for me was the judge's unequivocal condemnation of Sly Bailey, of Vickers, and of Piers Morgan. I don't think any of them would be expecting that to have happened. I'm sure they'll go on denying it because was the first level of defence, and it will be their last. Because I can't yet see the proof, but I think the judge is more or less saying what we've said all along. It's too incredible to imagine that they didn't know that something was going on, and if not, it was extraordinarily naive of them to imagine that they didn't know.
But presumably, Roy, as you've just said, they will inhabit the space to say that we didn't know, that they can't know that we knew, and we didn't.
Yes, I mean, I think that they will go on saying that because the level of proof, I think that's one of the reasons, by the way, this will never go to law, is that the level of proof in a case Prince Harry and his comrades in arms have brought, that wouldn't work in a criminal trial. They just don't have the level of proof, in my view. So I can't imagine for a moment that there'll be any action taken. They will go on denying it. We will go on asserting that it did happen. And that will, I'm afraid, that will be how things are not resolved and go on into the future.
So in that sense, does much change from today? Apart from the personal vindication for Prince Harry, which, as you say, must be considerable, apart from the vindication of others, perhaps to come as well, in reality, for the players involved, for the newspaper, does much change?
Well, look, I think chronology is important here. Firstly, the Daily Mirror, Sunday Mirror, and people of today are people by completely different people from that period in the hacking drama.
Yes.
So the organisation is different and already. So in that sense, already nothing has changed, will change. And you've got to feel sympathetic anyway to the current executives and journalists on the Mirror Group who are totally innocent of any of this, with the possible exception of the editor of the Daily Express who was named in the judgment, Mr. Jones. But apart from them, everyone else, there's been such a sea change several times over at the highest level. So will anything change? I think, oh, by the way, the other people that should be vindicated are the Guardian newspaper, who broke this whole story right at the beginning, never gave up on the fact that they had rightly discovered it, exposed not only hacking, but the important matter of the use of private detectives to obtain private information. But will anything change? I think it has changed. We've got a judge agreeing at last that this happened. But Fleet Street is a wholly different place now. And it doesn't have the influence, it's no longer the beast that it was.
Roy, the defence from Piers Morgan and others has been always to say that they didn't know everything that was going on at their newspaper. They couldn't possibly have known. First of all, how credible would you have ever said that was? And secondly, to slightly come back to you on it, I mean, did you know everything that was going on when you were editor of the paper that all of your reporters were doing and how they were getting all their stories?
No editor has stories brought to him or her without asking for the provenance of the story. The bigger the story, the more intrusive the story, the more you want to know how it was obtained. And I can't imagine during my period when I was associate editor at The Sun or editor of the Daily Mirror, or indeed when I was managing editor of the news department at the Sunday Times, I would have wanted to have known how we got stories. So I think editors did know. I've got to split this off from the suits, the people above. It is highly likely that Mr. Vickers and Ms. Bailey didn't know. But I think the editor always knows where stories come from.
Do you think that this ought to move in some way? Whether it will or not is a different question, but it ought to move to the realm of politics, that we should see something from politicians and even from the government to reopen this question of punishment or sanction. I mean, we know what happened with Leveson. There was supposed to be Leveson 2, it never happened. But should this really have been left to a prince to take something through the courts for us to get to the truth?
No, because I think Leveson 2 would have been... I always knew Leveson 2 would never happen. I knew that the editors and proprietors back after Leveson 1 had set their minds against it and ensured politically that it couldn't happen. But I think we might think that politicians should think about Leveson 2, but I'm afraid it probably, in realistic terms, I don't think it will now happen. I don't think there'll be much political heat. I don't think there'll be much legal heat. I'm just being a realist here.
So perhaps this is after a very, very long time, is this maybe the end, the final chapter of the hacking story?
No, I don't think so. I think there'll be more. I think there are more cases to be heard. I think that there are more people will pursue it through the courts. More money will be paid out. Look, I'm a pensioner at the Mirror, and I'm sure every other pensioner is probably fearing that this company could collapse and we'd be worried about whether or not there'd be enough money in the pot to pay our pensions. So it's not in our interest to bring down the company. But many of us who had nothing to do with hacking, and we are all in touch with each other, we're disgusted with what happened, want to see the culprits brought to trial, but at the same time, we don't want yet more expensive litigation, which will imperil the future of Trinity Mirror / Reach.
Do you think that's a possibility, that the company could collapse?
Gosh, look at the state of it. They've just announced 450 job losses, more than 300 of those among journalists. They're pulling in their horns, they're closing offices. Although this is the biggest newspaper company in Britain, it is, I think, facing a very, very tough couple of years, and its future is in doubt.
Roy, thanks so much for joining us. We're joined now by Dan Evans, who used to be a journalist for the Sunday Mirror and actually gave evidence in this trial brought by Prince Harry. Dan, did anything about this surprise you, this judgment?
No, not at all. I thought it's a thorough vindication for myself as somebody who gave evidence, not just in this trial, but the previous trial of 2014. So it was nice to have my evidence accepted by the judge.
And just remind people, what was your evidence? What did you say to the judge?
So I'm going to take that in two stages. My initial evidence formed what's referred to as the Goodall judgment. So that was the precursor to this. It kind of set up the entire phone hacking litigation against Mirror Group newspapers. And my evidence there was basically my story, how in my mid-20s I'm going to use the phrase corporately groomed by the editorial hierarchy at the Sunday Mirror and inducted into a world of sort of espionage, I suppose, which was the way in which they ran their papers. So the first trial was quite extensive and dealt with something they call quantum, i.e. how much a claim is worth. And this time round, they were looking at issues of limitation, i.e. the Limitation Act, which allows 6 years for people to bring a claim from when they ought to have known about it. But secondly, and possibly more profoundly, it dealt with what the board knew and what the legal department of Mirror Group newspapers knew and how the evidence of the company sits.
And what did you say they knew?
Well, I said that the legal department was fully aware of the methods that were used to get stories.
Which included phone hacking,
private
detectives.
Yeah, what they refer to these days as unlawful information gathering. So private detectives, blagging, general theft of private information using actors and agents. By agent, I mean professional investigative agents, not a showbiz agent.
And this was ubiquitous, this was widespread.
Absolutely, and the judge has found that today. Yeah. He's found that the editors knew.
Habitual, he said.
Yeah, absolutely habitual, yeah. And indeed, went on for a 25-year period, all the way up to 2011. So beginning at the earliest starting point, based only on these 4 cases that he's heard. Incidentally, there are many, many more in the offing. In around 1996 was the earliest.
And you used a very interesting word, and a pretty dark word. You said you were groomed to do this stuff. You were basically taken in as a young man and groomed to do this stuff. What do you mean by that? Why did you use that word?
Well, I was 25. I had arrived at Fleet Street with bright eyes and hopes of a stellar Fleet Street career. And having done a couple of years working undercover and doing investigations, I was sort of given a staff job and then brought into a bit of a magic circle of trust, I suppose. And once I was on the right side of the fence, as far as they were concerned, they showed me how they'd been getting their stories for, this was 2003. So on the judge's findings today, for the 9 years prior to that, they've been getting their stories through phone hacking. They lost control of a database, basically, at the Sunday Mirror. My old deputy editor, a chap called Mark Thomas, who was name-checked by the judge today, among the other editors who knew, had been doing it for MGN since whenever he arrived there, under Piers Morgan, of course. And he left the paper, left the Sunday Mirror to edit the Sunday People. And in doing so, he took away the knowledge of who to do this to and how to do it.
And what did you do personally?
So I was basically taught and tasked with rebuilding this database of names, of numbers, of PIN codes, of all the people of interest to that newspaper's readership.
PIN codes for the voicemails, for accessing the voicemails of the individuals concerned, the celebrities.
Yeah, 4-digit PIN codes of celebrities, of politicians, of their agents.
Because it's quite easy to do, right?
I mean, it wasn't rocket science. It was sort of basically a brute force hack. It was a case of sort of getting through to someone's voicemail and then interrupting the greeting by pressing a certain button and then entering the correct PIN code, which in some cases was a sort of default factory PIN, but in most cases it was personal to the individual. So my job was to guess them, basically. So
relevant dates or
dates of birth,
birthdays,
sometimes just patterns of numbers, just usually really quite obvious stuff, but sometimes more esoteric. Sometimes it'd be like the name of a loved one or something spelt out as if on a sort of alphanumeric
And you were very
keyboard.
successful in guessing them. Wasn't that hard?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it was a hugely taxing task, but I was pretty successful. I mean, for a while back there, I was regarded as being of information.
How many do you think you hacked?
What, individual people?
Yeah.
In the hundreds.
And did you, while you were doing it, did you wrestle with the kind of morality of it?
Yeah, of course.
So even at the time, it wasn't that you were just thinking, oh, this is what we do to get a story. But at the time, you sort of thought this was wrong and I'm wrestling with it.
Yes, absolutely. I have to say, though, it was one of those things that takes a little while for you to kind of really realise what's going on around you, because it was so endemic in the culture. It was, as the judge found, it was the way in which their news gathering operated. So, towards the end of my time at Mirror Group, which was sort of 2004, I was very conflicted about it. Maybe quite a sad person, really. Split me down the middle, and in the end, it's sort of those feelings are what led me to blowing the whistle some years later, which I did initially in 2012, and then it became public knowledge really in sort of 2014. I think
because you must have. I mean, it's self-evident, it's obvious, but you would have been listening to some very private, very personal stuff on occasion. I mean, that's what made it salacious and interesting in terms of stories.
Sure.
And so it must have been quite a thing to listen to, some of these things.
It was harrowing at times, yeah. And the worst thing about it was the way it was so commodified. I'd pass something up the chain to my bosses, which had been, really kind of resonated with me, and their reaction would be, fantastic, there's a story, wicked, let's clear the front page for that. There was no thought, there was no care given to the individuals involved. They were just seen as pieces of meat.
This is a story which involves a lot of people on both sides of it, in the press and obviously the victims of it and so on. There is, of course, one person who is getting a lot of attention today, and that is Piers Morgan.
Yeah.
He's spoken this afternoon, continuing to deny all knowledge. You worked at the Mirror Group, I think when he was editor still?
Yeah.
Are his denials credible?
Utterly implausible. There's simply no way that Piers could not have known what was going on his watch. If his deputy editor from the Daily Mirror, Tina Weaver, who went over to the Sunday Mirror and who taught me, knew all about it. If the people on his desks knew about it, if Mirror Group was spending around £1 million a year on unlawful information gathering and he was signing it off, if his chief executive officer in Sly Bailey knew about it and concealed it, as did the head of legal, Paul Vickers, the other senior lawyer, a guy called Marcus Partington, who was found to have not only known about it since at least 2003, which is when I became aware that he knew about it. Shortly after I'd been inducted, there was an incident in which he walks into the office one day quite breezily in the morning and addresses my boss, but speaks to me, looking at me directly, and says, "Good morning, have I got any messages today?" With a bit of a smirk. And, I read between the lines, and I was shocked, actually, even then, that the legal department knew. But that all just speaks to how cosy it was, how encouraged it was, how accepted and useful it was.
Because presumably your assumption or working assumption would be that other newspapers were doing the same thing. And so therefore, you kind of had to do it, because if you didn't, you would be at a commercial and competitive disadvantage by comparison to them.
I think that's a fair thing to say. I think probably there was something akin to a bit of an arms race between the different Fleet Street titles. And history's shown, of course, that it was endemic elsewhere, and it was put across to me as a commercial necessity.
So in terms of, Morgan will obviously continue to say what he's saying, and that he's said again today, he's never personally hacked a phone, which is perhaps more credible, that he didn't personally do it. But you're saying that the idea that he didn't have any knowledge of it is fantastical. It just couldn't be.
It's fanciful, yeah.
Dan, do you think that this story has got further to go? We know that there are more cases to come that Harry's still pursuing with other newspapers. It's obviously a story with it's been so long standing now, over a decade. Do you think it's got further to go?
I think it's got so much further to go. It's long standing because of the concealment that's gone on, and it's been sort of eked out, the truth, over this period through disclosure, through civil litigation. And that's why today's judgment is so significant, because the judge has found that, the witnesses that were put forward by Mirror Group misled the court. He found that even in 2023, the company was not being straightforward and upfront. And what it's invoked now are questions of, were shareholders misled? Was Parliament misled? Was the Leveson inquiry misled? Questions around criminal investigations, which were raised by Prince Harry's lawyer outside court today, and what I think most right-minded people would consider to be a case to answer, certainly for further investigation, because I think people will want to know whether or not the law applies equally to everybody in this country.
Dan, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Right, that is it from us for this week. By the way, if you're settling in to watch the final stretch of The Crown this weekend, released on Thursday, I think it's fair to say it's got a bit weird.
Many had been unable to imagine life without Elizabeth II. But after almost 50 years on the throne, it's out with Queen Elizabeth and in with King Tony. New Britain has a new royal family, the Labour Party.
I'll bring back the Churchill stuff, please. John and Emily couldn't be here this week, unfortunately, not after last night's newsagents' Christmas party. I didn't think it was possible for anyone to drink that much Pernod. Thanks to our production team on the newsagents, what's left of them: Gabriel Radis, Laura Fitzpatrick, Georgia Foxwell, Alex Barnett, Rory Simon and Shane Fennelly. Our editor is Tom Hughes. It's presented by Emily. Won the Christmas quiz Maitlis. John, I've been to 3 US embassy parties in a week, Sopel, and me, Lewis, sorest of heads, Goodall. We'll see you on Monday. Have a lovely weekend.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.